It's great to be here again with you this week. I'm excited to share the second part of the sermon series looking at Luke 15. What is it about airports that have such a special energy about them? Have you ever been to an airport and you go to the arrivals hall, and it depends on where you're at, you get a totally different energy according to that airport. You know, if you're maybe, in Chicago, you get a lot of business people moving through. You get a lot of people holding signs, say, Mr. Patterson, your taxi awaits, or whatever that person might be. Similar in Heathrow, you get a lot of people coming in for business. It's a really important city, moving a lot of traffic around, but you also get a lot of families receiving people. But the airport that always sticks with my mind for this mix of chaos and joy and love is the airport in Amman, in Jordan. It's insane. You walk in there and you get these groups of families because, of course, if you're going to go pick up a loved one from the airport, everybody comes. Mom, dad, brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, everybody is there. And so, you see it sometimes, like, again, you go to Heathrow, maybe Madrid or whatever, you'll see 2 or 3 people come out, give someone kind of a quick hug, and then they're out, and they're whisking off into the car, off to do whatever they're doing. Not in Amman. It's a party in there. You get everybody, there's singing, there's dancing, there's joy, there's hugging, there's crying, there's ululating, there's everything. The airport becomes this wonderful, chaotic, joyous scene of welcome. It's a beautiful thing that we find there. Now, looking back at Luke 15, I just want to remind ourselves that we started out with a story of one lost sheep amongst 100. And then we lost a coin amongst 10. And now we're losing a brother amongst 2. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had, traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property. In dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up, I will go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But when he was still a far way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then his son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on, and he replied, Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he got him back safe and sound. Then he became angry, and he refused to go in, and his father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you. I have never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I may celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with immoral living, you killed the fatted calf for him. Then the father said to him, Son, You are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead, and he has come to life. He was lost, and he was found." There's a lot to unpack here. And again, I say we have often listened to this story, read this story, been immersed in this story for years and years. It's one of the most famous stories that we have in the Bible. But of course, at the same time, we often approach this story from our 21st century Western eyes, and we miss some of the deepest, most beautiful parts of the story. So I want to unpack some of these things with you this morning. First off, when the son approaches and he says, I actually should back up for a second. I would even say the name of this probably shouldn't be the prodigal son, but rather something on the lines of the father with two sons, or the compassionate father with two sons, because this isn't about the prodigal son. It's not even about the older son. It's about the father and what the father does there. When we look at this, and the son approaches the father and he says, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." This is not breaking any laws. This is not an illegal thing to do. Of course, it's a massive slap in the face. And in a Middle Eastern culture, you're basically telling your dad, "I wish you were dead, give me all your money." It's not exactly a nice thing to say. So we can say here, it's not a law that it is broken, but it is a relationship that is broken with what this son says. He has not broken the law, rather he has broken his father's heart. Now, when we think of this sort of inheritance and this wealth and everything that would come along with it, we often, in our minds, we think, okay, bank account, numbers, what is he going to get? Are we talking 250,000, 500,000, $1 million? What is he getting from the father? They're clearly a family that's established, well off. This is important. We can see later by the fatted calf. But in this day and age, the family's wealth was in the property shared amongst in the village. This may have been animals. It may have been a cluster of homes. It may have been land that they could use to grow crops. So to suddenly lose a third of what they had would have been a huge blow to the village. So this is not exactly a good thing that he does, not just to the father, but of course the village as an entire clan. We also say that, we see that he goes off a few days later. He's selling this quickly, whatever he's doing. He's liquidating his assets. He's getting rid of this as fast as he can. He's making a hasty sale. He's not exactly being prudent and getting the best money that he can, the best value for the things that he has there. It seems like there is no trust between the son and the father. The son does not trust the father to guide and lead him in his life, but rather he wants to take control of things. He wants to do it himself. Therefore, he asks, "Give me the power, give me this money." The prodigal son ultimately is demanding privilege without responsibility. You see, he uses this really long, wordy phrase. The direct, natural request should have been, "I want my inheritance." In Semitic languages, this is 2 words. But rather, he goes and says this convoluted phrase, "Give me the share of the property that falls to me," which in Arabic or Hebrew would have been 6 words. So he is significantly increasing what he is having to say. He's avoiding something. We have a common word for inheritance that's used throughout the New Testament, but in this case, it's a completely different word that's used by the son. And it seems to be a word that conveys an idea of wealth instead of inheritance. Because you see, along with inheritance came an acceptance of leadership and responsibility. You didn't just inherit the property, you inherited a position, you inherited a role, you inherited a need to do things within the family. Maybe that's administering property. Maybe it's helping to solve family quarrels. Maybe it's defending the family honor, these sorts of things. He would be pledging himself to increasing the clan's wealth through that inheritance. He would be building the house of the father, which is a really strong ancient Near Eastern concept that he wants. But in this case, he uses a different word. He uses a word for wealth. He simply wants the privilege without any of the responsibility that comes along with it. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had, and he traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. Now, in the first century, Jewish tradition would have it that if someone who inherited this sort of wealth were to go off and squander it, say, in a foreign land, he would be cut off from the village. And it was a ceremony that would be called the kezazah. And essentially what would happen is if he were then to go back to the village, they would come out, a group of villagers would come out with a large pot. They would break it in front of him and literally just say, "You are cut off from the village," and that person would never be welcome to go back in. Again, this is one of the things that we don't often understand when we think about the power of the village life. We're used to much more solitary sorts of livings. We do come together in groups like this, but we don't live in villages like they used to in the ancient Near East. We lose the kind of power and the sense of what this would have meant to be completely cut off from your village. So this would have been a really scary thing. And of course, we see in the far country, he squandered his property. This concept of the far country is just simply meaning it might be something nearby, but it's something distant enough and culturally distant enough that it would have fit the bill for being cut off from the village. And again, this idea of squandered, scattering is the word that essentially is used. It's the same thing that if you were scattering seeds, you're just throwing them onto the ground. The same word is used when they're separating the grain in the threshing fields. So this idea is that he's just sort of wasting the money. We've often assumed that the interpretation of this is that he was living immorally, but it's more likely that actually what he's trying to do is build some social credibility with people by actually being really generous. He's throwing big feasts, he's inviting a lot of people over, he's helping out with this, he's doing that. He's trying to build up his social credibility, something that he would have had in his father's house. But the moment that he took the wealth and the moment he left with that, he lost that sort of social credibility. So he's trying to build that back again. Aristotle describes a prodigal in this way. He says a prodigal means a man who has a single evil quality, that of wasting his substance. So for centuries, the Arabic translations just simply use the idea of extravagant living. And again, we're thinking about this. He's building up whatever he can to try and make a life out there. So now we get this famine hits. And again, this is the sort of thing. We hear about famines. We hear about droughts. We see these sorts of things, but we haven't lived that same sort of experience. There are accounts, for example, in the 19th century of some of the famines and British officers being out stationed in the Middle East, going through these times of famines. And it's so severe, people are arming themselves to protect their shops. They're making sure that no one can steal the things. People are so desperate for food and they cannot find it. It is an existence and an experience that we are so far removed from. This was definitely a very difficult experience for this young man. And he's trying to figure out, how am I going to live? What's my next meal? What am I going to do to survive? And one has to ask the question, why not go home? On one hand, we have to say, or we have to imagine, that broken relationship was enough to keep him away. If he would have gone home, he would have had to live with his brother's scorn all these times. And it's important to point out that when the prodigal son demands the inheritance of his father, the brother does nothing to intercede here at this point. And again, in the Middle East, in this time, the brother would have been the one to intercede. He should have been the one who says, hang on, come on, let's make things okay. Don't leave. You're okay with the family. He should have done something to try and stop the brother from leaving, but we have no accounts of that whatsoever. It seems that not only does the prodigal son have a broken relationship with his father, but he also has a broken relationship with his brother. And if he would have to go home at this point, he would have to live off of his brother's inheritance. Because as the story says, the father divided everything between them. So the brother now has his side of the inheritance, which would be 2/3 of the property, and the prodigal son wasted his 1/3 rather quickly. So if he went home, he would be indebted to his brother and his father, and it was probably a little bit too much for him. And at the same time, he would have to face the village. It's not just his family that he messed up with. It's that entire village clan. He would have to have the kezazah ceremony. That would probably be happening right in front of him, someone breaking the pot. And we just struggle to understand what it's like for someone to face that sort of village life in these day and age. Look at something like when we look at Mark 10, we have the story about Jesus' mercy on Bartimaeus. Now, the word Timaeus probably comes or is derived from the Hebrew word for unclean, bar meaning son of. So this literally is a guy that they're calling son of filth. And this is that sort of village attitude where someone, because he's a beggar or in a bad position in life, you can imagine the kids are jeering at him, calling him names, and eventually this name sticks until such a point that even in the gospel account, his name is son of filth. Facing the village is an incredibly scary prospect. So we have instead that the son went and he joined himself to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him in the fields to feed swine. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. Now, again, some of the translations that we have in English suggest that he's got a job, he's been hired, he might have some sort of income, have some sort of ability to gather food, but actually the word that we have here is this idea of gluing oneself to someone. We still see this today, and many times in places in the Middle East, you might drive out somewhere, you park up, and next thing you know, you have someone washing your windshield, say, oh, I'm doing you a favor here, or you're going into the shopping, and they take your bags, and they're like, we'll handle this for you. They are gluing themselves to you in hopes that they may get some sort of reward. In the same sense, in the Middle East today, people don't really do a good job of firing each other. If you are doing a horrible job and they need to dismiss you, and your position is terminated, rather than firing you or dismiss you, they will give you a job so horrible that you'll quit. And this is exactly what we see here. They know that this man is a Jewish man. They know that he wants nothing to do with pigs. So what do? He says, okay, fine, yeah, you can help me out, go feed my pigs. He's given a job so horrible he can't stomach it. He can't even eat the food that the pigs are eating. And in this day and age, during a time of famine, the sort of typical thing that would happen is that when you butchered an animal, you would leave the less desirable parts of that animal where you butchered it for people with lesser means to come and take those parts and have some food. But he can't eat the pig. He has nothing to eat. He's starving. He's dying out there, and he's gluing himself to these people, trying to find some way to survive. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but yet I perish with hunger? I will arise and I will go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your skilled craftsmen. The younger son finally comes to himself, and for centuries, especially in the Western tradition, we have taken this to mean that he repented. No, he definitely is not repenting at this point in the story. He says, he does not say, I am shamed or I have hurt my family, I have caused my father deep pain. No. In fact, some of the Arabic versions of the story actually say, rather than he came to himself, it says he got smart. He's a wily guy. He's trying to figure out a way that he can still get some things together. So he comes together. He says, okay, I've got a plan. He makes a plan to get back home. He's going to make this really humble speech, and he's going to earn his way back. He will be a skilled craftsman. Notice he says, oh, Father, make me one of your servants. No, he doesn't say, Father, let me be a slave in your house. No. Father, make me a servant. Give me a position. Let me earn my way back into the household. Let me pay back what I have taken and what I have ruined from this. Jesus, of course, at this point, we have to remember, he's addressing a scholarly audience, people who would have been very familiar with the scriptures. And you notice this phrase that he says, Father, I have sinned before heaven and in your sight. He's actually paraphrasing Pharaoh after the 9th plague when he's speaking to Moses, and he's supposed to be all contrite and everything else, and all the pressures on Pharaoh. And in Exodus, he says, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. But we all know Pharaoh wasn't exactly repenting at that point, was he? His heart was still hardened, just like the prodigal son. He's scared to go back and live in the family home. He says, instead, I will go and get this blue-collar job. I will earn my way back into the family. As a paid craftsman, he hopes that he can earn back his place. And he hopes that he will impress his father with this supposed humility, and then at the same time, that his father will be amazed with his ability to generate his own success. He anticipates some sort of servant-master relationship with his father. And this, of course, is one of the big debates that we have in the first century, and Jesus is bringing this to the Pharisees. Are we God's servants and he a law-giving master, or are we his beloved children and he a compassionate father? The prodigal does not yet see that the real issue is not broken law, the money that he took, but actually a broken relationship. Reconciliation is not yet part of this immediate plan. He wants to eat, and he says so. He's hungry. He's thinking about the bread that his father's servant has. He wants that. In the deepest sense, the prodigal son is not going home. So he sent off and went to his father. But while he was still a far way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and he put his arms around him and he kissed him. Nothing in a village happens in solitude. Nothing in a village happens in secret. These are so tightly knit societies that when one thing happens everywhere, echoes and reports of that happen immediately next door. We used to refer to this in Jordan as the Bedouinet. What would happen around would pass through the Bedouin faster than a phone call or the internet or anything that you could have. It was amazing how quickly news could spread from one place to the next. The father breaks all rules of Oriental society at this point as he runs down the road to reconcile his son to himself. Now, the word that's being used here for run is not jog or saunter or speed walking or quick pace or anything like this. He is racing. This is the same word that's used for any sort of sport that would have happened in the day. Think Olympics, think marathon, this sort of running. That's racing down the road. And at the same time, Luke is choosing these words very carefully. He wants people to know this. The father saw him and had compassion, and he raced down the road. In part, you have to wonder, what is he actually doing? Is he outrunning the villagers with that big pot? He's racing down the road. And it's important to say that in the Middle East, no man of his age or position would ever run. They always walk in a slow, dignified fashion. And at the same time, for him to do this, imagine these guys are wearing these long robes. In order to race down the road, he's having to take this robe, hitch it up. He's exposing his thighs to everyone, which was very scandalous. You have to understand. He's exposing his thighs to everywhere. He is shaming himself in front of everybody at this point in time. It is out of his compassion that this father races out to his son. He takes it upon himself to take the shame and humiliation due to the prodigal. Now, we know that the servants, of course, are also part of this crowd. Everyone is gathered around. We've got this tense moment. The father has run out. He's there with the son. And of course, what happens here after this scene, after the reconciliation, no one in the village can reject or despise the son. The father sees him, receives the son, and he kisses him. Again, this is one of these words that we miss it a little bit when it's just the Father kissed him. The word that's used here is this word for very passionate. It's kissing again and again and again. It's that same thing that I would see in the airport in Amman, that when someone would come out that door and you have the kids like trying to go by security and say, are they here? Have they arrived yet? But the moment that person comes through the door, if it's a son and he sees his father, he throws himself on his father's shoulders and he kisses again and again and again and again. And it's this sort of deep set emotion that we're seeing here, except in this case, it's the Father doing it to the Son, which is absolutely not what anybody would have expected there. At this point in time, the Son says to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. The prodigal changes his mind, and he doesn't finish his speech. Many times, in many traditions, many interpretations of this, we assume that the father cuts him off right at this point. You know, the moment he says, I'm no longer worried to be called your son, and the father's like, shh, no, get the robe, get this. No. The son is finally changed at this point in time when he sees what the Father does because of the meaning of the fact the Father races, humiliates himself, outruns the villagers with a big pot to restore his place in the village. And instead, the Father orders a party, just like the shepherds, just like the woman, when they found what was lost. The Father said to the servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and make merry. For this son was dead and is alive again. He is lost and he is found. And they began to party. The best robe is naturally the Father's finest robe. This would be whatever he would wear at the best of occasions. It would be the nicest robe. It'd be very rare to take this out, and he puts it on his son. The ring that is placed on his finger is likely a signet ring. That means that he now has power to act on behalf of his Father. He is once again restored into sonship. And shoes on his feet may be a symbol of his rank. Obviously, the servants and the slaves, they didn't wear shoes. But the son of the Father's household wears shoes. Now, his elder son was in the field, and as he came and he drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. The word that is used here, this elder son, is that same word that would have been used to describe the groups of scribes and Pharisees, the elders of a village, the respected ones of the village. Jesus could have easily said the other son, but he uses that word to point back to the scribes, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, those who drew near and heard the music and the dancing. As he approaches the house, he hears this music and dancing. The elder son would have heard that drum at a distance. We can imagine that rhythm would have told him that some sort of joyous gathering was in progress. As he approaches, he calls one of the young boys and asks, what does this mean? And the boy says, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has received him with peace. He tells the older son that the father has received a sinner and is in the process of sitting down and eating with him. The same thing that the Pharisees were accusing Jesus of doing. Your brother, and it's important to note that the boy does not say that your brother has returned. Your brother has arrived. You see, the word returned in the Bible often means this idea of repentance. And again, it's important to note here, no, the son has arrived. The son is here. He simply appeared. It's that moment that the son appears that things begin to happen. And of course, the word peace, he has received him with peace, is also this idea of shalom, this famous word that we know from Hebrew, which encompasses all of these ideas: abundant living, peace, quality, serenity, but also reconciliation. But he was angry and he refused to go in. So his father came out and he entreated him. At a banquet, such as this, the older son often would be standing as a sort of head waiter. The importance here is that the difference between him and the other servants is that he joins in the conversation with the seated company. So the older son would be part of there, but at the same time, the family is trying to say to whoever the honored guests are, you, our guests, are so great that our son is your servant. Could the older brother bring himself to serve his younger brother? Word of the son's refusal, of course, reaches the father immediately. This is that tight-knit village society. People know that the brother's outside. He's angry. Nothing is secret in the village. And because this is in public, the rebellion of the older son is more serious than the earlier rebellion of the younger son. Everyone in the banquet hall, you can imagine, they're tense right now. They don't know what's going to happen. What is the father going to do? The assumption would be that the older son should be punished immediately or ignored until the guests are gone and then dealt with harshly. For the second time in the same day, the father shames and humiliates himself in front of the entire village. The father came out and he entreated him. We can't even begin to imagine how scandalous that would have been for people at that banquet to see the father get up, go out, and entreat his son to come in. He goes out to entreat, not to punish, not to condemn. The word that we have here is a word that means to call. So we have something like in kaleo, which might be call against or accuse. Eis kaleo, call in or invite. Epikaleo, call by name. Prokaleo, provoke or challenge. Proskaleo, summon or call to oneself, such as an officer might do with one of his subordinates or a master to a servant. Synkaleo, call together. Parakaleo, to appeal to, entreat, or try to reconcile. Luke, of course, is well versed in the Greek. He knows which words to use. In that same verse, we see that the older son summons one of the younger boys. He's using proskaleo there. But here we have instead parakaleo being used by the father. People might expect instead that the father should have used something such as the challenge or accusing, but no, the father uses parakaleo, to appeal to try and reconcile to the son. In one of the famous older Greek grammars of the New Testament, the commentary on this part is simply saying that he says that para merely means beside or alongside, and pros suggesting facing one another. So in other words, the father is calling the elder son to stand alongside with him and to look at the world from the father's perspective. Only the Father is able to restore, and restoration is through grace alone at this point. We could imagine that Jesus could have looked at the Pharisees and he could have talked about the sinners and these tax collectors and these people there, and he could have said, oof, they're unfortunate people. Isn't it our duty to show them some kind of kindness? But at this point in time, Jesus rather throws out a challenge. He not only accepts them, he races to restore them with open arms. He eats with them, and when they accept his love, he kills the fatted calf in celebration of the success of his costly efforts to reconcile that person back into the family. This fatted calf, of course, this is the Wagyu beef of the day. This is the best of the best. It's the expensive cut. This is what everybody dreams of being able to enjoy. But the story's missing a conclusion. We don't know what the older brother does. We don't know what happens to the younger son at this point either. The reality is, brothers and sisters, is that some of us here today are prodigal sons. Some of us here today do not yet have our heart in that place, and we have to remember that this story doesn't say anything about how we earn our way back. It's exactly this concept of letting ourselves be found. But perhaps a harsher reality is that many of us here are also the older son. Many of us here are those leaders. Many of us here are those people in positions and influence. Perhaps like the older son, we are actually called out to stand next to the Father and share the shameless love that he had, a love that's willing to humiliate itself in order to reconcile people back home, a love that breaks with all the cultural norms of our day in favor of restoring relationships and bringing back people back home. There are certainly broken relationships here. There are broken relationships in this room. There are broken relationships amongst ourselves, brothers and sisters. There are people who need the robe, the ring, and the sandals placed upon them. There's no room to judge anyone in our midst today. If anything, this story shows us that forgiveness has no depth and that the forgiveness is an act that moves beyond repentance. The Father doesn't wait for the Son to repent. The Father forgives, takes him home, and proclaims him his Son. There is certainly work yet to be done. The Son will have to live with the consequences of his actions, but the Father is faultless. So today, brothers and sisters, will you accept being found, and will you stand alongside the Father?